Welcome to Disc 2, where I am here with Bill Solis, and we are going to continue our discussion on the Jeremiah 49 prophecy, which we are seeing as a tremendous prophecy. We're kind of calling it Phase 1. So here we go.
So we're going to start with Iran, and that is subject to two prophecies. We're going to talk about the one in Elam, Jeremiah chapter 49. Iran is actually the subject, got double trouble in the end times, the dual end time prophecies. There's one written about Elam. When you look at a modern day map of Iran, you have Persia and you have Elam. We'll take another look at a map here for you. Elam hugs the Persian Gulf on the west coast side of Iran. It's the area shaded in the orange peach color, and Persia comprised all the rest of Iran off to the east of that point. Now Ezekiel wrote about Persia in Ezekiel 38 verse 5, but Jeremiah wrote about Elam in Jeremiah chapter 49 verses 34 through 39. Two separate prophecies. Now Jeremiah actually wrote about Iran first as far as covering Elam territory before Ezekiel even wrote his prophecy. Jeremiah wrote around 596 BC, this prophecy, and Ezekiel wrote his prophecy about 10 years later. But I want you to notice on the map there's a nuclear reactor there called the Bushehr nuclear reactor. It's the crown jewel of Iran's nuclear program. It was started to be constructed in the 1970s. After the revolution in 1979, Germany, who was helping construct it, went away, and then Russia in the 1990s decided they would help finish that project. So they helped complete the project of the Bushehr nuclear reactor, which went online in 2010, I believe it was. Now, we're going to talk more about the Bushehr nuclear reactor and Russia's involvement with it in a few slides down the way. But just so you know, keep your eye on the fact that there's a nuclear reactor in the area of the prophecy that we're going to be talking about. So I want Mondo to read the prophecy. It's only 6 verses. And then we're going to go ahead and unpack it individually.
Yeah. Jeremiah 49 verse 34 says, "The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet against Elam in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah king of Judah, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the foremost of their might. Against Elam I will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven, and scatter them toward all those winds. There shall be no nations where the outcasts of Elam will not go. For I will cause Elam to be dismayed before their enemies, and before those who seek their life. I will bring disaster upon them, my fierce anger, says the Lord, and I will send the sword after them until I have consumed them. I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy from there the king and the princes, says the Lord. But it shall come to pass in the latter days, I will bring back the captives of Elam, says the Lord."
In the latter days. That's the same exact words that Ezekiel uses in Ezekiel 38, in the latter days. So we're talking about an end times prophecy. I want to just first of all break down that first part of the first verse. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet against Elam in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah the king of Judah." Understand the setting at the time that this prophecy was written, in 596 BC approximately. At the time, Babylon had already conquered Elam in 612 BC. Then 3 deportations of Babylon conquering Israel and Judah area ensued between 597 to 581 BCE. And then, so therefore the first deportation was in 597 BC. Zedekiah was the king at the time when the first deportation was going on, and he was being defiant. Okay, so Jeremiah issues this prophecy about Elam at that time. Now it's important to note, because we're going to talk about this a little bit later, that Elam was already conquered by Babylon in 612 BC. Some people think that this prophecy deals with the Babylonian conqueror of Elam, but Jeremiah wrote about it after that conquest had happened. So I just wanted to clarify that.
That's very important for people to understand that, the timing on some of this. And here we have a timing factor clearly written in the text.
In the latter years. But we're going to address some of the arguments that maybe it already found fulfillment. It's clearly a prophecy. There's no doubt that it's a prophecy. So what Mondo talked about, we're going to summarize these real quickly, and then we're going to unpack them individually, each topic. The Lord gets fiercely angry, and he's going to bring about a disaster as a result of his anger. He's going to destroy from there the kings and the princes. In other words, there's bad leadership. There's troubling the Lord. And they want to launch something lethal somewhere, that he's going to break the bow of Elam at the foremost of their might. He's not going to enable them to launch something lethal somewhere. Now this is going to bring about a disaster, because it says he will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven and scatter the indigenous population, the exiles of Elam, as a result of the disaster, worldwide dispersion. We're going to get into that as well. He's going to cause Elam to be dismayed before their enemies and before those who seek their lives. And he's going to send the sword after them until I have consumed them. So it means that Elam at the time, Iran at the time of the invasion, will have a menu of enemies, plural. So we'll get into that as well. The good news is the Lord is going to set his throne in Elam. And in the latter days, he will restore the captives, the exiles of Elam that get saved after the tribulation. We believe they'll be scattered before the tribulation, any unbelievers in this area. But some of them will get to know the Lord throughout the tribulation, survive the tribulation, bless their souls if they can get through that. And they will be this area will be restored, and the captives will be brought back as believers into the millennium. So we're going to get into all that. Before we do, why don't we talk a little about this Iranian nuclear deal?
Yeah. I mean, when you think about what's going on right now in our current situation, I mean, you have the JCPOA document that was really signed by Obama back in 2015, and even back then you had really Netanyahu going as much as he could diplomatically, trying to dissuade the American government from signing on to this deal. And now, interestingly, when you look at the current political events, we look back and we go, man, that deal was horrible in 2015. We know that when Trump came to office, he pulled out of the deal, and now they're trying to reestablish it. And it's interesting that we thought it was bad in 15. What they're now trying to do with all the world leaders, it's even worse.
And this is a tough thing about doing a DVD that will last for a long time, is we don't exactly know the outcome of those negotiations, because as we sit here right now, they're in their 10th round of talks, renegotiating that deal in Vienna. So we don't know the exact outcome of that. It has not been resolved at the time of this sitting. So we can't dare to really tell you what the outcome of that's going to be, but we can tell you what the outcome of the prophecy is going to be, and we're going to go there. Now it's interesting, at the time that happened, now in 2000, let's set this back a little. In 2012, Leon Panetta was the Secretary of Defense for America, and he said that Iran was really close to getting a nuclear weapon, and that he suspected at that time Israel was going to invade Iran. That was way back in 2012. Of course, negotiating started to happen from that point until they finally put together that JCPOA in 2015. And at the time that happened, the day after it was consummated, Obama's foreign policy on Iran, he had said, with this deal, we cut off every single one of Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapons program. And Iran's nuclear program will be under severe limits for many years. So he was very proud of that accomplishment. And it kind of reminded me at the time of Jimmy Carter, who was president back at the time of the Iran Islamic Revolution. And they took 52 hostages and held them in captivity for 444 days, and Jimmy Carter couldn't do anything about it. So I was very concerned what was going to happen in this foreign policy. And it turns out we got something like this as a result of that.
So we got a little humor here for us, but in many ways that you look at what's going on, and yes, we know that the final, really the final circumstances of this new discussion are not done yet. But what I think is fascinating is that the United States, I want you guys to think about this, because all of this is contributing to the geopolitics of Iran and their friends and their proxies and all the things. Is that one of the things that has come out was that we have invited Russia, the United States has invited Russia to negotiate with Iran on our behalf. And so what the current things that are coming out is that you think about this. Russia is the one that is building the nuclear plants for Iran, right? But yet they're negotiating on our behalf. It's like inviting the fox into the hen house. I mean, when you think about some of these circumstances, it's absolutely crazy. And the reason why this is important is because we know the prophecies, but again, we're watching the steps that lead up to the fulfillment of those prophecies. And one of the steps that is currently out there is these increased nuclear reactors that are there, and Russia being given $10 billion outside of the current sanctions that they're doing in order to build these, but it cements the tie between Russia and Iran. But it also, these reactors are happening right here in this Elam area.
That's right. We're going to show you that Russia's actually building a Bashar 2 and a Bashar 3 shortly. Russia is part of the P5+1. You've got Russia, China, Britain, America, France, and +1 is Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right, Russia's involved. It's a stacked deck for Iran.
It's a stacked deck.
And Russia and Iran, of course, show up in Ezekiel 38, not the prophecy we're talking about right now, but they form an alliance then. They're forming that alliance right now, as is Russia and Turkey and Iran. So again, another indicator that this prophecy is becoming.
I think it goes back to what you were describing, just in the idea of why would the Lord be so angry? You know, the fierce anger of the Lord. But Iran is just determined to build these things, and we know that their target is Israel, and the Lord's upset about that because Israel, even though they're in a state of unbelief, they're still part of the covenants that God has made. They're the apple of his eye. And God is upset that anybody would try to destroy his covenant people. Right,
and we're going to actually show some of the rhetoric, some headlines about how Iran is so hostile toward Israel and why the Lord would be angry with them fiercely at this point in time. You know, remember, if there's no Israel for Ezekiel 38, that can't happen, because it happens in the land of Israel, and God makes his holy name known through his people Israel, and he's the Holy One in Israel. So if there's no Israel, if Iran takes out Israel and wipes them off the map with a nuclear weapon or two, then God's going to have a lot of egg on his face, because he won't be able to make his holy name known and put the world on notice. So, you know, the stakes are very high for Iran at this point, and they need to know this prophecy. And so a lot of the Iranians actually do know about this prophecy, and I'll be talking about that as we conclude on this session.
I mean, they know that they're able to read the Bible, and they know Elam, and they know Persia, and they know their own history. But when we think about this, we got to remember too that the whole end time, and we showed a map of the whole end time prophetic scenario, and the prophetic scenario is very satanic in the sense that Satan's goal has always been is to wipe out Israel from being a nation, because we know that what's going to bring Jesus back at the second coming is when the nation of Israel calls and asks him to come back. But if there is no nation Israel, then we can't have the Lord's return. And so we see not only this anti-Semitism here leading up to the Ezekiel 38 war and these other wars in advance, but then even during the tribulation, Satan goes after them in Revelation 12, especially the second half. So you have this biblical theological paradigm which we're seeing unfold right here.
That's right. It's unfolding in front of us in the church age here.
Yep.
And we're actually going to see some of God unleashing some of his judgments on these countries that despise Israel around them. And we might actually witness those, and that's why this DVD becomes very time sensitive. I want to say a few more things. The day after Obama thought it was a good deal, Netanyahu came out and rebutted it, and he said Iran is going to get 100 billion to 300 billion, which it will be able to use to fund its terrorism and its aggression in the region. Remember, Iran has proxies throughout the Middle East. We'll talk about those. Its aim is being to destroy Israel. I'd say that this is a double bonanza of a guaranteed pathway to a nuclear arsenal and a jackpot of money to continue its aggression. Actually makes this danger of war, even nuclear war, even a lot greater. So even back then in 2015, Netanyahu caught on to what was going on.
You know, because we have the prophecies, we know where this is going, and especially as we develop Jeremiah 49 a little bit more. And so when we see some of these decisions that are being made we look at it and go, is anybody have any common sense here? Is anybody paying attention? We recognize that there's a certain level of blindness that's happening because we know the end. And so when we see these crazy things, these crazy decisions, these deals, these negotiations, which aren't negotiations, again, you're inviting your enemy to come in and negotiate on your behalf. We shouldn't be shocked because we know the direction that it's going.
It's insanity.
It's insanity.
Now, the day after that, Donald Trump made a comment and said, this is the worst deal. Now, this is before he became president. And one of the campaign promises he made on the campaign trail when he was running for office was dealing with this Iranian nuclear deal. But here's what he said: this is the worst deal ever. They get $150 billion and we get nothing. Yeah. And then Vice President Pence, again before the presidential nomination, he went further and said the Iran deal will be ripped up if Trump gets to be the president. And sure enough, what happened was Trump got us out of he withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018. But the problem is, since that time, Iran has been in strong non-compliance of the rules and regulations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're a member of the NPT, that's the acronym for it. They signed on in 1970 when the Shah was in power, and that entitled them to the rights to have nuclear energy for civilian purposes as a member.
Yeah.
The problem is they're not in compliance with the rules and regulations, and no one trusts. Ayatollah Khomeini comes out and says, according to Sharia law, we can't have a nuclear weapon, but no one trusts.
Yeah, no
trust
one believes
those statements.
Them. Yeah, no one believes them.
Okay, so since that time in 2014, just prior to the nuclear deal, Kerry said that Iran was two months away from having a nuclear weapon breakout. That was in 2014, just prior to the signing of the JCPOA. 2019, Iran announced, this is after the withdrawal of Trump from the JCPOA, announced it has advanced centrifuges and is producing higher enrichment. These are news headlines, you see the dates and the sources. September 9, 2020, Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is 10 times the limit that was allowed on the JCPOA, 2.5 tons. So they seized the opportunity when Trump backed out to move forward toward a nuclear weapon. January of 2001, Wall Street Journal, Iran begins enriching uranium to 20% purity, which they were supposed to only go to 3.5%, something like that with the JCPOA. January, same month, Israel National News. Iran rolls out 1,000 additional advanced centrifuges. So they're moving forward like gangbusters on their program. And then in April of 2021, Iran is enriching uranium to 60%, its highest level ever. And the reason that's alarming to Israel, and it should be to all of us, is that's a stone's throw away from getting to 90%.
Yeah.
And when you get 90%, you have a nuclear weapon capability.
You know, when you look at and you see these stats here, and you see these dates, these kind of timestamps, as they have moved forward, and they've just blew through all of the other regulations that they weren't following anyway. And now, when they're coming to the negotiating table, this is where they're starting from. They're not being held accountable to say, hey, you need to go back and undo what you've done over the past 3 years. In fact, they're going, oh, you want to start here? Okay, well, we'll start here. I mean, Benny Gantz, even today, I read this morning that he was commenting on the severity of the situation, in that originally Iran had 10 kilograms of material, and now they're up to 50 kilograms of material. And so this is bringing it all to a head where, as we see here, it's almost like there's a hook in the jaws, even in the Jeremiah. I know that's an Ezekiel situation, but we almost see it here because God has an appointment with Jeremiah 49 to fulfill. Because one of the things he says there is that this will come to pass.
That's right, and you make a good point. Iran is not interested in rolling back to the 2015 terms of the JCPOA. They're interested in getting their sanctions removed and moving the goalposts forward so they can stay where they're already at. And again, like we said, we don't know what the outcome of that's going to be, but we do know the outcome of where their nuclear program's headed, and that appears to be in Jeremiah chapter 49. Yeah. The next headline I want to read, which is very recent, in January of 2022, Israel says that no matter what happens with this JCPOA, this is Naftali Bennett, the current Prime Minister of Israel, he says, we will not be bound by any nuclear deal with Iran. Now, this opens up a subject of Israel's what's called the Begin Principle.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's important.
Yeah. It's interesting that you've had him on your show before, Bill Koenig.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, White House correspondent Bill Koenig. We're friends, and he and I were having breakfast together at a pre-tribulation rapture conference in 2013, I believe it was, with an Israeli diplomat, former ambassador to the United States, called Yoram Ettinger.
Mm-hmm.
And at this time in 2013, I was thinking Israel was going to strike Iran's nuclear program, even back then. And I said to Yoram, and I said, do you think Israel is going to strike Iran's nuclear program? And he said something very interesting to us. He said the Menachem Begin, he drew our attention back to a historical moment in Israel's history. Menachem Begin, who founded the Likud party in Israel, he became the prime minister in 1977, first Likud prime minister. And at the time, Iran was a friend of the West because the Shah was in power. But in 1979, 2 years after he became prime minister, the Islamic Revolution happened. And the West started to support Saddam Hussein and pulled away from support of Ayatollah and the Islamic mullahs and things. And Saddam Hussein seized the opportunity to start building the Osirak nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
So Israel found themselves in a precarious position because Iraq was an enemy of Israel. They'd been at war with them in 1948 and subsequently. So Menachem Begin called together, your manager is telling us about this meeting, all the chief intelligence officers, the head of IDF, Mossad, he got them all in a private discussion.
His cabinet together,
He got them all there at a critical time in Israel's history. And he asked them all to deliver what they felt would happen if Israel struck that nuclear reactor. And they all pretty much agreed in a consensus. They said, one, you'll bring the West against us because they're supporting Saddam Hussein. You'll bring the Islamic and Arab world against us. You'll hurt our economy. And they had a list of 3 or 4 other bad things. And Menachem Begin looked them all in the face and said, I appreciate everything you just said. I know you're sincere about your concerns about our future.
And they were all true statements. They were
true
all
statements. He said, but let me ask you all one question. What happens if Israel is inactive and it has inaction on this program, this nuclear reactor? He said, it's a possible destruction of the Jewish state. We will act, and we will act now. And they went in 1981 and they destroyed the Osirak nuclear reactor. And that created what is called the Begin principle. It's got precedent with these prime ministers of Israel, meaning we will act unilaterally, we don't need other nations' support, we don't need a coalition, and we can act preemptively. And they did this again in 2007, and when Syria was building at the Al-Kabar nuclear reactor, they took it out too.
Yep.
So the point being is that Israel has a Begin principle they're operating on. And they do not care if they have a coalition, great, but if they don't have a coalition, they are prepared to strike. And I'll show you some headlines from Benny Gantz and others as they are prepared to do that.
You know, I think this is extremely important because, again, as we're watching this, we're seeing that, let's put it where it really is. And the stakes are, and Israel knows this, it's not just, oh, they're going to lose Tel Aviv. Their entire existence as a people, as a nation, and they don't look at things just in the sense of temporary. They look at things in the sense of their history. There's been anti-Semitism for the last 2,000 years. I mean, it's kind of always been that place. And they are very often, you'll hear them say, never again, referring to the Holocaust of World War II. So they have it in their very psyche that they, at the end of the day, they will go at it alone if necessary.
That's right, and they've got the principle of doing that. And they know they really have to defend their own survival. They're watching what's going on with the inactivity of the West in Ukraine, and they're very concerned about what's going on there because they realize, hey, listen, we have to go on our own as well because the West may not come to our rescue as well. So it's very interesting. Now we're going to start to unpack this prophecy, Mondo. Let's go through the very first thing you talked about. There's going to be a disaster because the Lord is fiercely angry. Is the Lord fiercely angry with Iran right now? We're going to look at that. I believe this is a condition right now. He's angry because there's bad leadership, and he's going to destroy from there the kings and the princes. So I'm going to have you read a little something in Isaiah 44, so we can talk about, this did not happen during the time of King Cyrus of Persia, because he was actually one of the great kings of the Bible. He was prophesied about from Isaiah.
He was an Iranian, if you wanted to say it that way.
He's from Persia, and it's from 600 to 529 BC. Isaiah prophesied about him around 720 BC, 100 years, well over 100 years before he was even born. He's a notorious king and one of the greatest kings in the Bible in the Old Testament in Isaiah. And he's one of the most celebrated individuals in Persian history.
Yeah.
So go ahead and read Isaiah 44, verses 28.
It says this, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid.
And of course, Cyrus, when he conquered the Babylonians, he sent the Jews back and to fulfill this prophecy. And so, you know, he's actually a noted individual. So this did not happen at the time of the Persian Empire, this fulfillment of, this was not bad leadership. God would not destroy the kings and the princes at the time of Cyrus because he's got Cyrus doing his bidding.
In the next verse, in 45:1, I mean, it calls him anointed, his anointed.
That's right.
That's a very powerful, special word of compliment.
Right, and he was one of the first to create a declaration of human rights to the nations. He wrote it's called the Siren's Cylinder. It's a cuneiform writing. It was written between 559 BC to 530. The cuneiform script, it's in the British Museum. But he was actually built a cosmopolitan empire by bringing in together the remaining Jews that did not go back to Israel, the Babylonians he captured, the Elamites of the area. So he was not a bad king. He was not going to destroy Elam. he was actually trying to bring them into his cosmopolitan empire. He's one of the most celebrated individuals in Iran. Every New Year on Nowruz, they celebrate their New Year. Tens of thousands of Iranians go to Cyrus's tomb to just show you this individual. Matter of fact, Israel still honors Cyrus. They minted a coin when Donald Trump was talking about moving the embassy to Jerusalem and promoting the building of the Third Temple. So I just want to be clear that that particular king and princes of that time would not be destroyed by the Lord. They did not fierce the anger of the Lord. But what about now?
Yeah, I think that's important too, because when you think about the timing of Jeremiah, roughly 600 BC, he's contemporaries with Ezekiel and Daniel at the time, and oftentimes when you look at those that are seeking to interpret the Bible, they're looking at, well, was this fulfilled in ancient times? And so, I think, if I understand you correctly, God is not calling Cyrus and the Persians evil and wicked. This is something that's going to happen in the latter days. And so when we see the current administration of Iran and their goals to really wipe out, they would love to, as they've said very clearly, they produce maps when Israel's not even on the map.
That's right. And so the point is, some leadership that needs to be destroyed is fiercely angered the Lord.
Yeah.
And therefore he will execute vengeance in this judgment prophecy that you've read and we're going over.
Mm-hmm.
Now you'll notice in the next image, you don't see Ayatollah Khomeini's image on that coin.
Yeah.
Okay, now I believe we're talking now about the leadership that the Lord is angry with,
Yeah.
that want to wipe Israel off the map, like you said. Let's look at a few things to prove evidence of this. In the World Without Zionism conference, imagine a conference like that. I didn't attend that, World Without Zionism.
The title, The World Without Zionism.
In other words, that tells you everything in the title.
Yep.
At that time, the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, said Israel must be wiped off the map. Now that's a clear statement of wanting to commit genocide and annihilation of the Jewish state. We had in May of 2016, an Iranian commander said we can destroy Israel in under 8 minutes. In other words, not only do we want to wipe them off the map, we want to destroy them in 8 minutes. You have another headline in 2019, Iranian general says Tehran aims to wipe Israel off the global and political map. In other words, erase them all the way through. Not only them, but the Ayatollah. He said Iran's leader says Israel is a cancerous tumor that needs to be destroyed, and he went on and developed a 9-point plan, strategic plan how to destroy Israel in 2014.
Let's stop here for a minute, only because you started in 2005, and then we have 2016, then we have 18, 19, and now we're 20. And when we think about Iran as an example, Iran is one of the richest nations in the world as it relates to oil and other forms of energy. So when you think about energy, why would Iran need a nuclear reactor, Bill? Really, if they have all the energy that they need, because they are claiming that they need the nuclear reactor for energy.
Right, well, they need a nuclear weapon because their goal is to establish an Islamic Shiite caliphate throughout the Middle East that rules over the Islamic world. And with a nuclear weapon, they can shift the balance of power to do that. They've already got their tentacles spread throughout the Middle East with their proxies, who we'll be getting into, because those proxies are the subject of wars, proxies as well. Lastly, on these slides here, Iranian commander says in April of 18, the date has already been set for Israel's destruction. And an Iranian official says that we will fight the enemy from Lebanon. Well, there's interesting. That's a proxy of Hezbollah up in Lebanon with 150,000 missiles that Iran gave to them. So, I'm going to end it there, but I think the case is clear. The Lord is angry with this leadership, because if they wipe Israel off the map, there'll be no, he won't be able to make his holy name known to his people Israel.
Yeah, that's very important, because there's a lot of things that are important here. I keep saying that, but it is in the sense of highlighting that the very existence of Israel puts God's reputation on the line. We see that in Ezekiel 38 and 39. But the whole idea of them trying to, if they erase Israel, then God is not a promise keeper.
That's right. Yeah. And he made an unconditional covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He would have descendants forever, and that would be the Jewish people. And so, his whole covenant capabilities are online. It's an unconditional covenant.
Amen.
So we're going to move on to the next topic. They're going to break the bow of Elam at the foremost of their might, because this bad leadership that's angering the Lord wants to launch something lethal somewhere. let's talk about the bow for a minute. They want to break the bow of Elam. You know, a bow, of course, an archer has a bow. In his quiver, he has his arrows, and he launches his bows. Of course, we're not talking about bows and arrows. You can't get bows and arrows from Iran to Israel, and if you could, there wouldn't be any fiery darts that could do that much damage.
The imagery here is integral, because when you think about it, it doesn't say I'm going to break their shield, I'm going to break their sword. You know, when you think about a bow, it's an arrow. It's something that it's an offensive idea. It's an offensive weapon that attacks somebody from a distance. I mean, I don't think you could have a better, Ezekiel, how did he know, right? In the sense of understanding what we're seeing today it's not that Iran is going to attack Israel with a tank. I mean, we've been talking about the ICBMs and other things.
Right. They want to launch something lethal. They've got ballistic missiles that can get to Israel in 8 minutes. Mm-hmm. They've got rocket launchers and underground missile silos. They're working on ICBMs as well as we speak. They've got a few of those already. Just history on Elam in Genesis 14. Mm-hmm. They show up, Chedorlaomer of Elam. He was in a war with 5 kings versus 4 kings, and that's when Abraham's nephew Lot got captured. Mm-hmm. And Abraham took 318 trained servants and rescued Lot. So they had a history of war going way back to the book of Genesis. Isaiah 22 verses 1 through 6 points out that they're expert archers. So the idiom of God saying through Jeremiah, I'm going to break your bow, and you're not going to be able to launch what you want, your missile launchers. I believe we're talking about modern day technologies. They didn't have missile launchers back in Jeremiah's time.
And this technology is extremely advanced. I mean, Iran also is seeking to become one of the nations that has gone into space, and so launching for satellites and other things. So their technology to not only hit Israel, but again in their space program is extremely advanced as well.
That's right. They're a very formidable foe for Israel, not to mention the fact that they got proxies all around Israel. So he's going to break the bow of Elam, but more clues here is at the foremost of their might. And at this point in time, that would probably be alluding to their nuclear program. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon with rocket launchers and missile silos that are capable of hitting Israel in 8 minutes, they could take out the whole Jewish state in 8 minutes if they had enough go there.
Talk a little bit about I don't think it's too much of a sidetrack rabbit trail, because when we think about the philosophy or the ideology or the religious ideology or doctrine of Islam, some people say, well, you know, imagine a skeptic watching this, you know, well, why would Iran bomb Israel, or, you know, because mutually assured destruction? They would never do it. What's the theology that would say that that's not true?
Well, it's interesting. You have to understand Islam's eschatology. They have their own eschatology, you know, end times thinking. They believe, and Ahmadinejad, former Iranian president, was strong into this belief. They believe that if you create an apocalyptic condition, especially in the Middle East, especially with Israel, you're going to hasten the coming of their Messiah. They call him the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah. So they don't really fear that much. They believe they'll win, and they believe that the good thing is they're going to hasten the coming of their Messiah. So it's like playing chicken in a car race, right? But this guy don't care if he loses. You know, so this Israel's going to swerve off. No, they're going to strike Iran, is my estimation.
And this is why you see a lot of the, you know, again, the suicidal bombers and stuff in Islamic theology. But here, imagine you're playing chicken, but you believe that God has told you to play chicken in order to hasten the return.
That's right.
I mean, they have this again, religious passion and zeal behind them. So I like your word apocalypse. If they can create apocalypse by wiping out Israel, they would be fulfilling God's word according to their own thinking, as well as bringing the return of the Messiah.
Right, and if they want to establish an Islamic Shiite crescent, there's Shiite is Muslims versus Saudi Arabia, and 80% of the Arab world, Islamic world is Sunni. They would be able to do that with their Mahdi came down. It'd be clear evidence, hey, we're the Shiite faction of Islam is correct.
Yeah, we're not dealing with sane, you know, we're not dealing with sane people in that regard. But when people are fully committed to this religious thinking, they're consumed. They're consumed with it. They're willing to lie. They're willing to cheat. They're willing to kill in order to get. And they know that really the only way they're ever going to defeat Israel is a nuclear weapon.
Right, and. Well, just like Russia right now is not acting like a rational actor on the scene invading Ukraine, Iran is even more irrational
Yeah.
because of their Islamic beliefs and that's fueling them. So let's talk about break the bow, prevent the missile launching capabilities at a time when they've got a nuclear program. I suggest that could be what Jeremiah is trying to allude to here. It's in the latter years, we talked about that. Here's a comment here that Benjamin Netanyahu said, even back just before the nuclear deal was consummated in 2015. He was in a press conference with Angela Merkel of Germany. The goal here is to prevent Iran from the capability to manufacture and deliver nuclear weapons. Break the bow, right? That means zero enrichment, zero centrifuges, zero plutonium, and an end to ICBM development. Because none of these elements, none of them is necessary for developing a civilian nuclear energy, which is what Iran has claimed that it wants. In other words, remember, we won't want to get a nuclear weapon, we want civilian purposes. Then why are they developing ICBMs and all these centrifuges and that sort of thing that can go into a nuclear weapon and ballistic warhead? An example here, Iran, in Newsweek, this is in March of 2016, Iran tests ballistic missiles carrying a message that Israel must be wiped out. In other words, this was on the missiles, the ballistic missiles. It says Israel must be wiped out. We're going to show you a video here of the threat, because what you're going to see here in this video is rocket launchers and missile silos with missiles in the Elam area, which is the closest point of attack from Iran on the west coast to Israel.
So let's make sure we understand. This is a video that was put out by who?
I believe by Iran. So you just saw that those missile launchers and rocket silos are in the Elam area, and I want you also to note, Mondo brought this up earlier, that Russia's still got contracts going on with Iran to build more nuclear reactors in Bushehr. There's a Bushehr 2 they're working on, there's a Bushehr 3. Now, they're supposed to be done, respectively, Bushehr 2 around 2024, Bushehr 3 around 2026. So depending, Mondo, on when this disaster happens, it could actually involve 3 different nuclear reactors in that area. Israel's going to have to go after those missile silos and stuff that are in the Elam area. You see on the image there, that's where they're at. They're the closest point to Israel. It's possible that when Israel's taken them out, breaking the bow of Elam at the foremost of their might, and again, we're not saying it's Israel exclusively, but we're going to show you that it's probably a military invasion, not an earthquake. And they could easily go over and take out those nuclear reactors as well, because we think there's nuclear implications to this particular prophecy. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. Now, we do want to make a note, though, that also the Iranians, when they built Bushehr 1, they built it where 3 tectonic plates converge. Not a good, in real estate, they say when you buy a piece of property in America, you look for 3 things: location, location, location. Well, apparently Iran was thinking we need tectonic, tectonic, tectonic. But they had an earthquake there on April 10th of 2013, highly seismic country in Iran, right at the Bushehr area, killed 37 people and 850 people were injured. They had another one 6 days later, 7.7, 35 killed, 112 injured, down south in Iran. But that prompted the Gulf Cooperation Council of States across the Persian Gulf, that would be Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, UAE, Qatar, some of those in the Abraham Accords with Israel, prompted them to be very concerned about the threat of nuclear radiation when that earthquake hit. And so they conducted a study, because there's 2/3 of the world desalinization plants are in that area where those Gulf Cooperation
They're only a few hundred miles apart. I mean, it's close.
Yeah. So here's their results came out. This was published in July of 2013 in Al Arabiya. Now get this, because they're going to talk about some percentages that are very alarming. The risk of radiation from Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, if there is an accident, is extremely high to the Gulf Cooperation Council states. Studies suggest that any leak from the plant will affect the GCC's water supplies, especially desalinization plant operations. In the event of a radiation leak, clouds of radioactive material will drift to the GCC states in just 15 hours. While radiation would affect only about 10% of Iranian population, in the GCC states, 40 to 100% of the population would be affected. 40 to 100%. They're saying their whole entire GCC states could be affected. The reason they say that is because the arrow there in the circle there, that's the Elam territory. Well, there's a mountain range there called the Zagros Mountains that has always geographically separated Elam from Persia. And so Tehran is across and blocked off by those mountains. So for instance, the GC countries are just on the other side. The large Iranian cities are further away. It's a 412-mile drive from Bushehr to Kuwait City, but it's a 665-mile trip to Bushehr to Tehran. Plus there's weather patterns.
Yeah, up over the mountains even, yeah.
Plus there's weather patterns, northwestern winds that could easily move those radioactive fallout over to the GCC states, and that's what they're very, very concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we move forward, we're going to keep on going with the summary. We believe that there's going to be a nuclear reactor, a nuclear disaster, not just a disaster, but it's got nuclear implications, because the prophecy goes on to say, I will bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven, and I will scatter them, meaning the Elamites, the indigenous population, the exiles, toward all those winds. There'll be a worldwide dispersion, not just going across the border. There's going to be a worldwide dispersion. He's going to bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven, and there's going to be refugees that come. Sounds like a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
Sounds like a nuclear disaster. Causes these individuals to flee. Syrian refugees coming to all the nations of the world. It says there'll be no nations where the outcasts of Elam don't go. Which, by the way, Americans should be ready to receive a lot of Iranian refugees, because where are they going to go? They're going to go where they've got family and friends and people that are already living outside of Iran. So for instance, here's some statistics here. The United States is the #1 country with Iranian-born individuals
Currently, right now.
Currently in the world. Canada falls quite a bit shorter, but then you go down to the United Kingdom, and they would be going to these places where they've got family in places. So Americans, be ready. You're going to be probably seeing some Iranian refugees coming out your way. We're seeing this with Afghanistan already, right?
Well, this is it's like reading a modern headline, because with Afghanistan, with Americans withdrew out of there, and that whole situation, you had Afghanistan people being brought into the United States. Even with the Ukraine situation, again, it's a reminder of how quick and easy it is when war happens that refugees flee, and you see them fleeing not only to the local area around Ukraine today, but they're coming to America. And so you see something like this, and the governments of the world are very, and even the United Nations themselves, they're very amenable to relocating refugees. So this is like modern headlines here.
Well, the clues to potential nuclear implications are break the world to foremost of their might. A disaster is going to happen. There'll be a scattering into all the nations of the refugees. So it does appear to have, there could be some nuclear implications to this particular prophecy. I'm looking at this prophecy as being on my radar as finding fulfillment, probably one of the next prophecies to find fulfillment in the prophetic timeline on the road to Armageddon, before we get to Ezekiel 38. Then we're going to get into, we're just going to get down to the final verses here. It says that he's going to cause Elam to be dismayed before their enemies, plural, before those who seek their life, and he will send the sword after them until I have consumed them. So what he's saying there is at the time that this disaster happens, there will be a menu of enemies, not just one, of enemies of Iran. So we're going to look at, does Iran currently have a menu of enemies? And sending the sword probably suggests it's going to be a military invasion. That's the typology in the Bible of a military invasion, not necessarily an earthquake. So I favor it's going to be a military invasion.
Well, will you, if you don't mind, comment a little bit, because one of the questions that comes up is, okay, well, hey, if Iran is going to be destroyed, then there's nothing left for the Ezekiel 38, 39. So let's make sure we provide a distinction between Elam and Iran, because Iran is broader, as we saw on the map. This is just one segment of the geography of Iran, right?
Right, and as we pointed out earlier, the Gulf Cooperative States were saying it may not even affect Tehran.
Yeah,
right?
Tehran's way to the north.
We're talking about a region in Iran, a sizable region in Iran on the west coast that's going to be hit real hard.
It's going to weaken them for sure, but it's not going to wipe them completely.
It's going to weaken them, it's going to take away their nuclear scenario, it appears to be. A lot of their ballistic missiles, their bows will be broken. But they'll be more angry at Israel. Russia will be angry at Israel because of their investments with Iran. and they will buddy up even closer for Ezekiel 38. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Iran of today is as powerful as it will be in Ezekiel 38. They may be compromised at that point, but they will still live to fight again.
Yeah, because they're going to be part of a very wide coalition of Ezekiel 38.
Right, and we're going to show the differences between Ezekiel 38 and Jeremiah 49, why they're not the same prophecy. So we talk about, does Iran have enemies presently, a menu of enemies? Because they're going to be dismayed for their enemies. Well, let's look at Israel. You remember Netanyahu spoke in the United Nations, and he had that little red line thing saying, listen, this is where they're going. This is a red line for Israel. So Israel is concerned about that. They've already got a project, the Iran project, code name for the newly established Israeli task force. This was back in 2018. For executing potential decisions to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, ballistic missiles, and our military bases in the Middle East. Again, break the bow of Elam at the foremost of their might. Recently came out, December 21, Gantz, the defense minister of Israel, said, I told the U.S. I've ordered the IDF to prepare a strike against Iran. He's familiar with the Begin principle.
Yep.
You know, he's warning the U.S. that we're prepared to do this.
In addition to this, you know, when this came across, this is all in the timing of the JCPOA renegotiating phase. But not only did he order that, but the Knesset, they passed legislation to provide $1.5 billion to make sure that this strike can happen.
That's right.
So the money and the will is there.
Right. So we're going to put a check mark by Israel as one of the menu of enemies.
Yeah.
And they may go it alone. And we're not told who does the disaster, but my guesswork is going to be Israel, and they may have to do it alone. But there are also other enemies at this particular time. For instance, when Trump got out of the JCPOA, he made this comment in 2018, the Iranian regime is the leading state sponsor of terror. It exports dangerous missiles, fuels conflicts across the Middle East, and supports terrorist proxies and militias. Well, we know that. We'll talk about the proxies as we go through some of the prophecies. Mainly we're still dealing with Iran right now. We haven't gotten into the other peripheral prophecies that are going to come forward. The other thing too is if Iran gets struck, they've already exercised and promised that they will shut down the Strait of Hormuz, and they have the capability to do that. And they plan on choking off a third of the world's oil and right now gas prices, who knows what they'll be when this DVD hits the market, but right now we're already concerned about oil and gas prices. So that would be a major globally impacting event. And that's why we want people to know that this prophecy is not going to, it won't be isolated from this in America. If this prophecy happens, you could be affected economically, heavily adversely. Yeah. Then one last enemy group here, we talked about the Gulf Cooperation Council. They're very concerned about Iran wanting to start a Shiite caliphate and getting a nuclear weapon to control the balance of power, shift the balance of power in the Middle East. Those countries over there, you see them on the map up there, they did that study about the concerns about the radiation, and they see the proxies of Iran are all around them. The Houthis are down below Saudi Arabia, attacking Saudi Arabia. Hezbollah to the north of Israel, Syria to the east of Israel, Hamas down in the Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad agencies, militias in Iraq. They're watching this all unfold. The last thing they want Iran to do is get a nuclear weapon and threaten the whole Middle East.
You know, that's something to say is that, you know, we got to remember that when we think about, we don't just throw all the Muslims in one category, as Bill's been mentioning. When you think about the Sunnis and the Shiites, you know, Mecca's down there, Saudi Arabia, they're Sunni, and they absolutely hate Iran. There's been talks in the past of them allowing Israel to use their airspace, which is unheard of. So for them, the enemy, my enemy, is my friend in that regard. And so if you can come across Saudi Arabian airspace, then Elam is right there.
That's right. And the Abraham Accords, there's political and economic reasons why some of these countries like the UAE and Bahrain, they're in the Gulf Cooperation Council. They're very concerned right across the Gulf about Iran and a nuclear weapon and a radiation problem. Yep. And Saudi Arabia has not joined the Abraham Accords as of the time of this, but they also want Israel to go to business against Iran. Yep. You know, because Israel is more powerful. Iran's a more powerful army than Saudi Arabia has got.
Sure. So, Bill, we've kind of discussed the Jeremiah 49. Really, this whole idea is kind of a phase one. So the question is, as we move on to the next, what we're calling kind of phase two, or the ramifications of what happens of Jeremiah 49. We're going to go into Isaiah 17. But the question is we've just discussed this possible nuclear fallout, this destruction of the nuclear reactor. There's people going, there's people fleeing, all the promises that God made. Are they just going to sit here and do nothing?
Yeah, is Iran going to just play possum? I don't think so, exactly. I think what we have is this begins a flurry of prophecies that we need to unpack here for the viewers. I think what we'll do, let's draw our attention, well, you go to Isaiah 17, I want to make a comment. Iran has proxies. Those proxies are in place for Iran to really fight against Israel. They're heavily armed and dangerous. Among the top of the list of the proxies is Syria. Bashar al-Assad regime is totally beholden. They're actually more than a proxy, they're an agent state of Iran. They've got chemical weapons. I think what happens is that Iran starts calling on their proxies to go to war against Israel. We're going to start looking at those proxies, the dangers they present, the prophecies they're in. And I think one of the main ones we need to talk about is Syria. Syria, I think, is going to come at Israel. They got chemical weapons. Something happens where Israel takes them out. Let's unpack the prophecies of Isaiah 17 and talk about what happens to Israel, what happens to Syria, and we'll do another camera angle on Jeremiah 49 about what happens to Damascus. Because Damascus is going to cease from being a city. Why don't you read Isaiah 17?
Before I read that, I just want to comment that, Bible scholars all around, I mean, we have all this data, and we're doing our best to try to bring some sort of scenario together, which the text says what it says, but we're conjecturing, on how we think it might play out. I mean, none of this is 100% gospel truth, at least is the way we're interpreting it, or the scenario. But what is true is that Damascus is going to go down, and I'll read. And so we just ask for, as always, we want to be humble about it, but we're trying to present these scenarios, especially and connect them as much as we can with the geopolitics of our day. So Isaiah chapter 17, verse 1 says, "The burden against Damascus, behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap." So has this ever been fulfilled?
No, there are some people who suggest it might have been at the conquest of the Assyrian Empire in 732 BC. I'll tell you why that probably is not the case, and I don't believe that's the case. But in Hebrew, it's talking about reduced to rubble. This is the oldest continuously inhabited city in recorded history. It dates back to the time of Abraham. It's the capital of Syria. Of course, it's been the headquarters of many terrorist groups, and many people believe some of Syria's chemical weapons are actually stored in this area here that they've used in their Syrian revolution. But at some point it's going to cease from being a city. We're going to find out that this is probably a result of a nuclear activity. We're going to find out who causes it. Now, some people who would suggest that this happened at the time of the Assyrian conquest, I point out, listen, in the 66 chapters of Isaiah, Assyria or the Assyrians mentioned 47 to 50 times, not once mentioned here. I want you to read Isaiah 17:9 because it actually tells us who is responsible for the desolation.
It says, "In that day, his strong cities will be a forsaken bow and an uppermost branch, which they left because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation." So before you comment, I mean, just in my own mind, I'm thinking, wasn't there a guy in the first century, a Pharisee named Saul, heading to Damascus? I mean, right, it still was there. It was still existing. There was still Jewish presence there. So Assyrian, 732, first century, Damascus is still there. It hadn't ceased to be a city, right? Right.
It doesn't have any promise of rebuilding. In other words, once it's gone, it's reduced to rubble, it's a ruinous heap. So that's a very good point, Mondo. What we're being told here is that not just Damascus area, but other strong cities, other major cities inside of Syria will be as a forsaken bow and an uppermost branch, which they left because not of the children of Assyria, but of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and there will be desolation. Now, he tells us there'll be Damascus and other cities that are affected and just desolated. We're going to find out from Jeremiah in just a moment where those cities actually are. So the thing that's very fascinating, we're going to read Isaiah 17:14, that Israel actually does this in self-defense, and they do it overnight, which means it's probably a nuclear attack. What caused Israel to get to that point? So go ahead and read Isaiah 17:14.
This says, "Then behold, at eventide, trouble, and before the morning he is no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us, and the lot of those who rob us.
So one night you see Damascus, and one morning it's gone. Because what happens is they've been trying to plunder and rob Israel. We're going to find in Jeremiah chapter 49, and we get into that in verse 25. It's dealing with Jerusalem on some level. So in other words, Damascus is assaulting Israel. The Syrian country, the Syrian army is coming against Israel. They're trying to seize Jerusalem area, and they're plundering and they're robbing, etc. Probably lobbing chemical weapons, what the case may be. We're going to get into some headlines on that. But all of a sudden Israel says, we have no choice. And they level a boom. Now Israel has nuclear technologies that can take out an entire city without sucking up all the dirt particles and contaminating the environment.
Bomb, yeah.
Yeah, it's a burst altitude. And I'm not a physicist or anything like that, but I think it's like 45-mile detonated at burst altitude. It'll go down, take out the city. So it'll have a mushroom cloud, but you won't suck up all the particles and stuff, because Israel's right across the border from Syria. And northwestern winds can come across and blow contaminations in. So Israel has to be very calculated. It has to be a strategic nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
But what can take out a city? Of course, the Assyrian Empire couldn't take out a city in 732 BC overnight with a bunch of bows and arrows. Yeah. But Israel can do that right now.
So let's kind of summarize where we're at here. We've been discussing the nature of Israel from a geopolitical perspective, taking a first strike at the nuclear reactors and taking out Elam because of their threat towards Israel. So let's kind of go play by play for a second. Israel does this to Iran. Iran sends a signal to their proxies to begin to attack Israel. We have Hezbollah, 150,000 rockets. They're coming, maybe Syria, Damascus area, they're coming down, they're threatening the Golan Heights. You have Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So you have this, now Israel feeling threatened enough, because it's all happening at once, because Iran has said, hey, look at us, look what they did, respond.
Right, and there could be escalation going on with Israel and Iran. In other words, they maybe haven't broken all the bow of Elam. They could be sending missiles in 8 minutes. Also, Iran missiles could be coming in. And I like what you said at the beginning of this phase, this segment. You know, we're being somewhat speculative here and humble about that, but it is prophetically supported. We're not really told in Jeremiah's Elam prophecy that it's Israel that actually does all that. It's our best educated guess.
Right. Yep.
But we are told in Isaiah 17 that it's Israel, the children of Israel, that caused the desolation. So I believe that one thing builds upon another. As the shoe drops on Iran, the proxies get called on. This could really happen at any given time in our modern history right now. And then we're going to shift our attention, if you want to go to Jeremiah chapter 49, we're going to get a different camera angle on this destruction of Damascus. Now remember, Isaiah wrote his prophecies between 740 and 701 BC. And that's when he issued his prophecy about the destruction of Damascus. Then Jeremiah, around 596 or 597 BC, much after Isaiah's time, has another prophecy on the destruction of Damascus. So in other words, this couldn't have been fulfilled between those years, because Damascus would have had to have been rebuilt for Jeremiah's prophecy to find fulfillment.
That's a really important thing to say is, you know, here we have, again, in the same passage that we were reading about Elam, right before this, the title of the section here says, the judgment of Damascus. Jeremiah 49 verse 23 says, against Damascus, Hamath and Arpad are shamed, for they have heard bad news. They are faint-hearted. There is trouble on the sea. It cannot be quiet. Damascus has grown feeble. She turns to flee, and fear has seized her. Anguish and sorrows have taken her like a woman in labor. Why is the city of praise not deserted, the city of my joy? Therefore her young men shall fall in her streets, and all the men of war shall be cut off in that day, says the Lord of hosts. I will kindle a fire in the wall of Damascus, and it shall consume the palaces of Ben-Hadad.
Okay, so this is a lot of important details that we didn't get in Isaiah 17 that we read so far. Isaiah 17:9 talked about strong cities being desolated in addition to Damascus area. Jeremiah puts an identity on those cities, Hamath and Arpad, which were major cities at the time of Jeremiah's existence, which probably represent Aleppo today, which is the #1 populated city in Syria. Damascus is number 2, but then you have Hama and Hamas, Homs and Hama, probably represented by one of these, by Hamath and Arpad. So we have cities to the north of Damascus. Jeremiah is talking about they're ashamed, they're faint-hearted. They've got to be probably involved in the desolation. Israel's taken out Syrian strong cities, desolation. It says there's trouble on the sea. Could this be a hint? It's probably the Mediterranean Sea. There's a situation on the Mediterranean Sea right now is that Israel has Dolphin-class missiles, at least 5 of them, that they got from Germany that have nuclear weapons that can be launched from the sea into Syria, Damascus. Could this be a clue that part of the attack on the destruction of Damascus actually comes from the sea? There's trouble on the sea, they're faint-hearted. There's trouble on the sea, they cannot be quieted. Israel has an underwater, this is a headline in the National Interest in May of 2019. Israel, an underwater nuclear power thanks to German submarines. So it's incredible that it's talking about major Syrian cities adversely affected, and we're talking about those particular ones probably dealing with Aleppo and Hama and Hamas. Now it's interesting, you read in Jeremiah 49:24 through 25, Damascus has grown feeble. She's fear because of what's trouble on the sea. She turns to flee, fear, and sees her in anguish, and sorrows have taken her like a woman in labor, which is a common idiom for a country or population that's going to come under attack. They go fearful like a woman in labor. But then he says this, a rhetorical question in the middle of it all. Why is the city of praise not deserted, the city of joy, or my joy? Well, that's Jerusalem. Now, we read in Isaiah 17:14 that Damascus was being destroyed overnight because they're robbing and plundering Israel. So the question is, I think poignant with Jeremiah is saying, why is Jerusalem, the city of my joy, not deserted, but Damascus is desolated? I think it's a very poignant question. He's thrown right back at Syria. In other words, look what you're doing for robbing and plundering my people. He goes on to say, Jeremiah chapter 49:26, therefore her young men will fall in her streets, and all the men of war shall be cut off in that day, says the Lord of hosts. You'd be looking at that as civilian casualties inside of the Damascus area in the streets. And he goes on to say, and I will kindle, and he talks about the men of war, that would be soldiers, the military. And he says, I will kindle a wall of fire about Damascus, and it shall be consumed, the palaces of Ben-Hadad. In other words, those are the palaces, those are the governmental buildings.
The leaders, yep.
A lot of detail. Civilian casualties, men of war cut off, governmental buildings destroyed, strong cities throughout Syria desolated as a result of the children of Israel. So these are extremely important details, different camera angle from Jeremiah chapter 49 on Syria's destruction and Damascus namely.
I think too that when you consider Isaiah chapter 17, as well as the scenario of what you have in Syria, let's think about this. These are people that even right now, I mean, they going back, they are just waiting for the opportunity to destroy Israel. There's never been a peace agreement with Syria. They still contest the Golan Heights going back to 1967. As we've seen lately in some of the General Assembly of the United Nations had mentioned that they don't recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Even Russia has made that comment recently. So you have a lot of bad blood here, and it wouldn't, I guess I'd say it this way, would we be surprised even tomorrow that Syria would launch an attack? Not at all, especially if they feel that they have the confidence not only of Iran backing them, but even in the sense of, I know Russia's not mentioned here, but we can't eliminate that Russia is entrenched in Syria. They have a base there along the coast. So would they feel emboldened enough to launch this attack, which would entrench in? So you have them plundering. This is what the Bible says, and then Israel feeling threatened enough that maybe they see that, hey, maybe Russia would get involved. We know Iran is already involved enough that they'd feel threatened to launch a precision nuclear strike to destroy Damascus. There's a lot of scenarios.
Right, we're going to show how this is a chokehold attack from the north with Hezbollah, all kinds of missiles, thousands a day, Hamas, 1,000 plus a day, possibly chemicals with Syria. Russia, we don't really have any details that Russia's involved here. They're involved in Ezekiel 38. But we know geopolitically, Russia has already told Israel that they don't want any more strikes. They don't support Israel's strikes into Syria.
Yep.
Israel struck several hundred times into Syria trying to stop the flow of weapons from Iran to get into Hezbollah's hands. They've also talked about they don't acknowledge the sovereignty of Israel over the Golan Heights.
Yeah.
So Russia could be another factor that emboldens Syria.
At least for emboldening them, yeah.
Yeah, but Syria's going to be coming after them. It appears to be robbing and plundering, and probably part of the proxy war with Iran. You know, so again, it's clear, Jeremiah 49:26, that this is a war. He said that the men of war shall be cut off in that day in the streets of Damascus. So this is a full-on war, and as a result of the full-on war, strong cities get desolated and Damascus gets destroyed overnight.
In this full-out war, is Israel just unscathed? Are they just relaxing? I mean, what's the thinking going on with them?
Well, I think we have some clues to that, because you're right. How can Israel's Iron Dome cannot withstand the kind of entourage that's going to come against it with missiles flying all over the place. They can only take out so many. And I think Israel does take a serious hit. And I want to draw the viewer's attention, have you read Isaiah 17:4-6.
Yeah. It says, "In that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob will wane, and the fatness of his flesh grow lean. It shall be as when the harvester gathers the grain and reaps the heads with his arm. It shall be as he who gathers heads of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Yet gleaning grapes will be left in it. Like the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 olives at the top of the uppermost bough, 4 or 5 in its most fruitful branches, says the Lord God of Israel." So this is in the context of the destruction of Damascus. So we're not taking things out of context here.
Right, it says in that day, which ties it right back to in that day that Damascus gets destroyed. And all of a sudden you get this imagery that is not good for Israel. Their glory of Jacob representing Israel will fade. Verse 4, Isaiah 17. His flesh will become lean, which happens as a result of war and the famine.
So they're taking a hit here.
Yeah. And he uses this imagery. He talks about the shaking of an olive tree with 2 or 3 of the olives on the topmost branch surviving, and 4 or 5 in the most fruitful boughs. Let's take a talk about the olive tree example that I think he's alluding to here. They're a very common tree found throughout all of Israel. They can grow up to 50 feet. A large tree can have upwards to 500,000 olives, and it's small and fruitful of the fruited variety. 500,000.
That's a lot, yeah.
Isaiah is saying there's 2 or 3 in the topmost branch, 4 or 5 in the fruitful bough. This is not a good, it talks about a shaking. The shaking is knocking off a lot of olive trees. It sounds, Jacob's glory is waning, his flesh is waxing lean. This is not a good picture. I take and put an olive tree on an image over Israel. The topmost bough would represent northern Israel. The fruitful boughs would be around more like Tel Aviv. Like the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 olives at the top of the uppermost bough. So let's take a look at this. In northern Israel, only 2 or 3 at the topmost bough. Look at, if Iran's war, proxy wars, includes all these people. You see the arrows pointing, you got Hamas down in the Gaza area. The Houthis can even say, they're saying they have precision-guided missiles that can hit Tel Aviv even now. They've got them from Iran.
So, I mean, for this audience, they might not, who are the Houthis?
Houthis are an Iranian established terror group based in Yemen that are confronting Saudi Arabia and the ongoing war. They're trying to, they've sort of taken over the Yemeni government, and Iran supporting them, the Shiites. Saudi Arabia supports the old Yemeni government. But they've been at war for quite a while. And they're another Iranian-backed terrorist group like Hamas and Hezbollah. Then you got Hezbollah to the north, Syria, Iraq, Iran. I'm going to show you some headlines that talk about how, in our DVD here, about the magnitude of this kind of an attack with Hezbollah with 150,000 missiles. Reports are they could fire 2,000 or 3,000 a day. Hamas could do 1,000 a day. Syria's got chemical weapons. They used them over 300 times in their revolution. You got Iraq. What if Iran's lobbing in missiles that can get there in 8 minutes, ballistic missiles? And I think what happens is Israel takes a hit to the north and maybe down into Tel Aviv. You got casualties. I think that's what Isaiah is saying. Isaiah 17:4-6 is talking about an Israel that seems to be getting hit hard As a result, they have to take out the strong cities in Syria. This is a major war.
You know, we don't want to miss this, because when you think about those rockets that are there on the Lebanon border, as well as in Gaza, if you want to say that, but even if we stay to the north, you know, these are rockets that are not, these particular ones by Hezbollah, they're not precision guided necessarily. They're indiscriminate. And so you imagine having thousands or tens of thousands of rockets landing in all through the northern area, Haifa, I mean, all the Sea of Galilee, all the countries, population centers getting hit, schools getting hit. I mean, as you mentioned, mass casualties, and really no end in sight. Israel, when you don't have a lot of people anyway, in the sense there's only 8 million Jews there, but when you're seeing these centers getting hit and large percentage of civilian casualties, they have got to make a statement to stop this.
Right. So the scenario we're putting forward is very realistic and believable. How can we think that Israel is going to go unscathed if all of a sudden Iran and Syria, I was talking about some of the headlines. The Gaza can match Hezbollah, can fire 1,000 missiles a day into Israel. That was in May of 2019 on Press TV. Jerusalem Post article, Hezbollah has enough precision-guided missiles for a confrontation. And Israel will be hit by 2,000 missiles in a day in a future war, an IDF general said. And then Syria, NPR reported in 2019, more than 300 chemical attacks launched during the Syrian civil war. What's to say that Bashar al-Assad is not going to use it against Israel? Why does Israel have to take out a city? Why does Israel have to destroy, desolate
the stakes are high,
So I think what we've got here, and I think what's going to happen is you're going to find, and we'll get into phase 3 here, I think what happens after that, if this scenario is going to be the way it plays out, is the other Arab countries are going to see an Arab city, the oldest continuous inhabited city, the capital of Syria, destroyed overnight by Israel's probably a nuclear weapon, strategically. And then they're going to say, what about Beirut in Lebanon? What about Amman, Jordan? Well, Amman, Jordan actually becomes a desolate mound, we're going to find out in an upcoming prophecy. What about Cairo in Egypt? What about Mecca in Saudi Arabia? What's to stop Israel from taking out our cities, just like they just took out an Arab city? And by the way, Israel's hurt right now. Jacob's glory is waiting, his flesh is waxing lean. Now would be our time to come together in a confederacy to destroy the Jewish state, that the name of Israel can be remembered no more. And that's how I believe we get into the Psalm 83 prophecy, which will be in our phase 3 conversation.
So you mentioned Psalm 83, and I think this would be good for us because, you know, let's do a summary here. Let's do a summary of what we're describing as phase 1, phase 2, and then into phase 3 of this whole, what begins in the Jeremiah 49. Kind of give us a summary.
Right, so we go across the Persian Gulf, we see Iran and their nuclear program is advancing toward a nuclear weapon. Israel cannot allow that to happen. It turns out Iran, and probably in nuclear capacity, is involved in the Jeremiah 49 prophecy. It looks like there'll be a disaster there. We talked about that. And then what's going to happen, we would probably suspect that Iran won't play possum. They will call on their proxies, which surround Israel to the north with Hezbollah, Syria with the chemical weapons, Hamas, Houthis. We talked about this in the first the second phase right there. And Israel goes into an all-out war right there. And what happens is they pay a price for that. And so does Syria, and so do some of the other proxies. At some point, though, ultimately, this burgeons into a major final Arab-Israeli conflict that I believe concludes in Psalm 83, which we'll go into our next phase. You see in the slide up here, we've got that the Israeli Defense Forces are involved in at least about 9 prophecies up there. We talked about Iran. We think Israel will be involved in that. We just talked about Syria. Now we're going to get into IDF versus Hamas, versus the Palestinians, versus the Hezbollah, versus Jordan, versus Egypt, versus Saudi Arabia, and blanketing and encumbering all the hostile neighbors in Zechariah 12. We'll make connections between Zechariah 12 and Psalm 83. So it's going to be, stay with us because it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, according to what you have here, we've only covered really number 1 and number 2.
Right.
Yeah. So what we're going to do here is we're going to end here on this particular disc, and then in the next DVD we're going to get into the rest of this number 3 all the way on, where we're going to get into the details of the prophecies related to Psalm 83, which we're calling phase 3. So stay tuned.